for data submissions right now.
And thanks to you all for joining us here. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of the ongoing work that we have looking at how we can manage and just really understand the costs associated with moving into a cloud environment. So just to give you a little bit of background, so I'm one of the co-directors of the AnVIL, which is NHGRI's cloud platform for biomedical research. As it says, it's a cloud-based platform, which just means that it's highly elastic. It has lots of capabilities for sharing data, sharing analysis, done so in a very protected way, controlled, with lots of controls in place to make sure that data integrity is in place, authorization, security, encryption. It's really a spectacular environment for collaborative research where just a lot of different analysis can all take place through cloud resources. Some of the major components of the AnVIL include Terra for workspaces and batch workflows, Gen3 for data modeling, DocStore for sharing containerized tools and workflows, Jupyter notebooks for interactive coding, Bioconductor for doing detailed statistics and visualization, Galaxy for developing interactive analysis and workflows. In many regards, I think of this as a researcher's paradise in the sense that all of the data, a huge amount of data has been loaded, huge number of tools have been preloaded. It's done so in a very scalable environment. There's no queues, there's no waiting. You can just push go and really dive into analysis that could just never been done before. To give one sort of example of this, so I'm a member of the telomere to telomere consortium, where we're investigating how that new reference genome improves our ability to identify variants across large cohorts. We were able to reprocess more than 3,000 samples very, very rapidly inside of the AnVIL. We did sort of a back of the envelope to sort of size up how long it would take to do at the data center at Hopkins or even in the NIH BioWolf cluster. We realized it was going to take many months, kind of approaching a year to do this analysis. There was just no way that we could wait for this. So instead, we developed something called a workflow description language, a WDL, that sort of encapsulated all the analysis tasks that needed to take place. We were able to apply it to more than 3,200 high coverage genomes, more than 1 million subtasks were launched, and very, very rapidly we're able to get through the results to sort of drive some of the major results from this manuscript. One of the things that is kind of most exciting to me as a sort of computer scientist over the years, as this analysis was running, we could take a sort of a peek at what sort of resources were being utilized. And we were very commonly using more than 10,000 cores all in parallel to make this analysis take place. Again, orchestrated through WDL, which I know Brian O'Connor has done a lot of work on. Very, very simple to scale up analysis over thousands and thousands of genomes. It's very exciting. When I presented this graph on one of the working group calls, one of my colleagues commented, you can replace the number of cores that are being used in any instance with kind of the number of dollars that are being spent in any instance, right? This is running inside of the Google Cloud Platform. The meter is always running to sort of fund those resources that are ongoing. So that's just a very different model than we're used to, on your own dedicated infrastructure at your institutional on-premise resources. And then furthermore, if you're trying to understand where these costs come from, it's quite complicated. At the level of the virtual machines, there's dozens and dozens of options available with regards to how many cores are available, how fast the processor is, how much RAM is available. And then beyond that, there's lots of options about how much local disk is available, how many IP addresses you need to have. All of these things are very carefully monitored by Google and other cloud platforms. Because these are precious resources and you're leasing them, you're renting them on demand in a cloud environment, and you have to be really, really mindful of how all those different components add up. So we, in the telomere consortium, as we're kind of getting ready, we put together a budget of about how much we thought it was going to cost, but there were a lot of unknowns. We were doing analysis that had just literally never been done before, which just made it, which introduced some anxiety. We had budgeted a certain amount available to do the compute, to host storage, to think about it. But one of my main anxieties is that would this be enough? Would this be enough? Would we actually be able to get through all the analysis that we want to do? This is analogous to so-called range anxiety. If you're renting a car, or if you have an electric vehicle, just not sure. Do I actually have enough? Do I have enough juice so I can actually get home at night? Just brings with it a lot of anxiety. That is just very different compared to on-prem computing. So what can we do? We think there's tremendous resources and capabilities and opportunities for cloud computing, but at the same time, we don't want analyses to be cut off, midstream. We don't want to, create a whole generation of anxious researchers. We want to welcome them into the researcher's paradise and actually support them through their analyses. So there are a few options available. Number one, at the sort of the top of the list, if you're in the United States, if you're an NIH-funded researcher, through the Office of Data Science Strategy, there is something called the STRIDES initiative, which is negotiated with all the major cloud vendors of pretty substantial discounts on the order of 10% to 25% for things like computing costs, storage, and related costs associated with working in the cloud. They also offer a number of professional services where you can kind of call them up, get some consulting about how things need to be set up. There's access to training. There's opportunities for collaboration where you can kind of work together to sort of overcome your research needs. I would also say if you're interested to work in the cloud environment, feel free to reach out to the AnVIL, call me up. We're happy to help you get oriented on the system. And I know that's true of all the NCPI platforms. Another thing that we've done specifically in the AnVIL for now, although this could easily be extended across the NCPI, is we've tried to provide some sort of documentation and educational materials to help you really understand where your cloud costs are going to come from and provide some guides for you to actually get onboarded and sort of map out what those costs might look like. So here on the AnVIL portal at anvilproject.org/learn, there's a number of resources available. Under this sort of investigators tab, there's some guidelines on how to prepare a cloud cost budget justification. And then here, if you click on this cost estimator, that'll pop open a spreadsheet, which tries to, in a very sort of systematic way, break down where your cloud costs might arise. So things like sort of a spreadsheet where you can just sort of type in what's your estimate on number of virtual machines you might need of different sizes, how many hours they're going to run, what's the sort of running cost associated with that, storage costs, networking fees. It tries to be really helpful. It's a very simple spreadsheet, but will at least give you some sort of framework to work in as you're thinking about this, especially if you've never worked in the cloud before. This will just sort of make sure that you have all your bases covered. And then once you fill out the spreadsheet, it auto-populates this budget justification that will just sort of, hopefully, sort of guide you through the submission process. We'll kind of break down in a very step-by-step way where these costs may arise. So let me just sort of walk you through some of the major features of this budget justification, some of the key principles that we've learned in sort of managing costs associated with it. So at the top here, we have sort of our, sort of guidelines for storage. There's kind of both long-term storage and sort of more temporary on-the-fly storage. Kind of the, in my opinion, kind of the most essential thing to do for storage is we want our analysis to be reproducible. We want it to be transparent. So what we really want to do is make sure all of the key input and output files are recorded, and then also that the sort of workflows associated with them are established. The good news is we have a workflow. If you have kind of the key inputs, if there's sort of intermediate files that you didn't realize that you were going to need, you can always recreate them on demand if necessary. Another sort of tip is for these large workflows, there's often sort of the input data, and then it may expand out to a much larger set of intermediate data, and then sort of, but the final results could be much smaller. In the case of the telomere consortium, we started with about 100 terabytes. Our peak data footprint was about 5 petabytes as all the FASTQ, all the BAMs, all those sort of chromosomes, specific slices and shards were established. So it was a very, very sizable data footprint. But then again, because we knew we had the workflows that were reproducible, we could call all the intermediate files and just keep sort of the final collection, which was about the same size as the input collection. Another sort of tip is along the way, keep track of metadata, keep the workflows. If you're recording, sort of any sort of phenotyping information, as you just heard about through FHIR and other systems, there's a lot of systems in place to help you record the data and metadata. You should not be inventing your own formats, your own standards. Let's reuse the ones that have been vested and proven the test of time. Another cost-saving technique is you want to use compressed formats wherever possible. That'll just sort of let you sort of get as much value as possible out of every byte, out of every bit of data. And then finally, within AnVIL, I know within many of the NCPI platforms, we have certain opportunities for free storage, meaning that we, the platform, NHGRI or NIH, will support the costs associated with hosting the data set. There's often, in the case of the AnVIL, we'll do this for consortium data. So if it's data that are designed to be shared amongst consortium or more broadly amongst researchers, we're happy to sort of have those long-term storage costs provided for you. Okay, so moving down this sort of worksheet here, there's a bunch of principles for computing. This includes both batch analysis, where if you have thousands of genomes you need to process, you want to use a workflow system, and then also interactive costs. On the interactive side, things like RStudio or Jupyter Notebooks, the costs there tend to be quite reasonable. Something like $1 an hour or less is pretty typical to have sort of a laptop like virtual machine running. So that's great. So rather than, if you have a classroom, you have analyses that need to take place in a shared environment, for a really small amount of funding, about what it takes for a cup of coffee, you can do that analysis in the cloud in a secure way and have all these sort of security guarantees, all the access to data, all those sort of components ready to go. On the batch side, this is where things get more complicated. Using something like workflow description language, a common workflow language, Galaxy workflows, the cost there can vary tremendously. Could be quite simple. It could do narrow a focus analysis for maybe a few cents, or with the click of a button, you can launch a workflow that may cost tens of thousands of dollars. It's really hard to know just from the workflow itself exactly how much it's going to cost. Your spend rate is primarily determined by the number of virtual machines running. And again, each virtual machine has different settings with cores, RAMs, GPU support, amount of disks. So it's the number of virtual machines running in parallel plus the amount of storage that will be occupied. So that's what's really going to determine your spend rate as a function of your workflow. And then ultimately your spend rate in terms of like the number of dollars per hour that might be spent is going to be limited by your quotas. Google Platform, AWS, Azure, they all have sort of quotas built into them. They feel infinite, but in practice, what is cloud computing? It's some warehouse of computers. There are physical resources there. There is a quota associated with it. And the different platforms will provide quotas for things like how many virtual machines, how many cores, even things like how many IP addresses can be assigned at once. So if you want to accelerate your analysis, you can ask for your quotas to be raised. If you're sort of easing into a new type of analysis that you've never done before, you may actually want to lower your quota so that you can throttle your spend, so you can sort of monitor it in real time, have a lot more control. If you're working in, say, a teaching environment, you may want to have a minimal quota to get your students started, but without enabling them to kick off a $50,000 workflow on accident. And then finally, for this work, you want to benchmark. You may have sort of an understanding about how long jobs take on your local environment. Because there's a lot of flexibility in the cloud with different types of virtual machines, but there's different costs associated with them. You want to benchmark to really optimize your workflows, to make sure it's as affordable as possible. We've been doing that in a few different ways to try to help researchers understand their cloud costs. A few critical workflows like running GATK, we've been very carefully trying to optimize the costs associated with them. And now what we're doing is sort of a more widespread initiative to really benchmark what we think are some of the most popular analyses that we expect to see. To do so, we're doing this in a very data-driven way, where we're looking at the historical usage of Galaxy to see what sorts of jobs different users have been done. I'm sure to this audience, Galaxy is a very familiar system, but kind of for this talk, kind of the key thing to keep mindful of, there's tens of thousands of users per month running hundreds of thousands of jobs, millions of jobs a month, keeping track of all kinds of biomedical research. And we've been able to go back and mine these data to get an understanding of what sort of workflows are very popular. And then that's where we're trying to place our attention to really model the costs associated with them. So we're kind of early in this process. So I'm going to give you some very early preliminary results, but what we want to do is over time, develop these resources and provide some APIs so that others can tap into it as well. So the first thing we're looking at is, what sort of jobs have been running sort of month by month, tool by tool, just to, again, in a data-driven way, we want to see what are popular things to do rather than just having, one investigator pick off the top of their head, what their sort of favorites might be. So some of this is a little bit Galaxy specific, things like upload, there's a dedicated sort of task that runs for that. But other components of this are quite sort of expected. Things like aligners are very popular, QC tools are very popular. As we sort of dive into it, you can see tools for RNA-seq or variant calling, ChIP-seq. It's sort of the usual suspects are very popular, but here in a very data-driven way, we can assess what does the community think are some of the most widely used tools available. So this is looking at just sort of jobs per month. Some jobs can run for a second, Some jobs can run from hours and hours or days and days. Here's another look at the data where we're sort of breaking it down by the total amount of CPU time. If we're trying to optimize our costs, these are the things that we really want to pay attention to. Again, it's the usual suspects primarily for RNA-seq or DNA analysis, variant calling especially, of different forms, and then the associated QC available for this. So now that we have kind of a map of what are some of the more popular tools available, in sort of phase 2 of this project, we're starting to develop workflows. They're going to execute them in sort of a scientifically meaningful way so that we can evaluate them in a reproducible way. And now what we're starting to do is run these workflows in both Google Cloud and also in Amazon Cloud to sort of hit the NCPI framework to be able to sort of understand what their costs are as a function of things like the size of the virtual machines, the number of nodes associated with it, and then also as a function of the size of the input data sets that are available there. So we're starting to collect those data now using some of what the community has designated as being the most popular and widely used tools and workflows out there. So we're starting to collect these data. So what I'm going to give you a sneak peek are some of the expected results that we're going to find. So again, we're going to measure sort of runtime, the computing requirements for these different workflows, and really so that's interesting in itself to know that, things like, I don't know, Bowtie 2 requires this much RAM, this much CPU time for our typical human genome data set. We're going to do that over many samples so we can develop that benchmark for one data set. But then we're also going to do things like scaling experiments to see what happens if we have not just one data set, but 10, 100, 1,000. Some things we expect to scale linearly, where if the data set increases by a factor of 10 or 100, the cost will grow by a factor of 10 or 100. But we also anticipate a lot of nonlinear scaling, where the cost will actually be more than you might expect just by scaling up by a factor of 100. On the right here, we have some, this is not our work, but some other great work that has gone on, benchmarking the cost with Google Cloud and Amazon Web Services to look at things like genome-wide association studies. And there they noted, depending on what sort of resources were available, the costs measured on the y-axis could scale many-fold. Depending on the configuration of your cluster, it could be twice as expensive, 4 times as expensive, and times thousands and thousands of genomes. If something is 4 or 10 times more expensive than you think, that's a lot of sort of wasted funding that could be further optimized. So we're really trying to get a handle on this and really understand it. And then to deploy it, this is going to come in a few phases. First, we're just going to build a simple spreadsheet that sort of collects all these data. Then we're going to build APIs so that you can query this in real time, so that as you're about to click the button, you can get some information about how expensive your workflow may be. And then we're going to look at sort of the characteristics, do some modeling. We hope that simple functions will be sufficient to model these costs. But if you look at some of these curves, it's hard to anticipate some of these very complicated relationships between the resources available and the costs that may be there. In the last minute here, let me just review the last couple sections. So another major cost associated with cloud computing is so-called egress. So as you move data out of, say, the Google Cloud or out of the Amazon Cloud, there's often a fee associated with that as sort of a function of the size of the data that is moved out. So whenever possible, the simplest way to avoid those fees is to just not move your data out of the cloud. Try to do as much work inside the cloud as possible. Another sort of cost-saving tip is whenever possible, rather than downloading all the raw data, maybe you can just download maybe some summary stats or distilled files. I get it. Sometimes it's useful on your laptop to be able to really rapidly prototype visualizations as you prepare those figures for reports or publications. But maybe you don't need to download everything. Maybe you can just do a summary. Another tip is, when allowed, rather than downloading the data, egressing the data many times, maybe you can share, egress once and then share it using other means. Again, only when you're allowed to do so. And then with AnVIL, we're also actively evaluating alternative approaches. That very popular GTEx data, for example, we mirror in an academic cloud so that other researchers can get access to it without any egress fees if they need to do work on their institutional environment. And then finally, research is hard. There's going to be unexpected costs. There's going to be unexpected challenges where things fail, things aren't just running right. So what we really recommend is, in your budget justification, and I hope our friends here at NIH will understand this, is that research is hard. You may want to sort of build in a buffer where if things go wrong, you have some funding available to get you over the finish line. One way to sort of propose this is if things go wrong, we'll have some reserve, or you can flip it around and say, if everything goes exactly as planned, here are some stretch goals where maybe there's some additional analysis that can take place. We can stretch into looking at the data in a new way, but it's not really essential, necessarily essential to getting all the results that you might want. The more exotic, the more, if this is the first time you've ever done this work or the first time anyone's done this work, that's where you probably want to have more in reserve. And then start small and then scale up in a very sort of step-by-step fashion so you have no cost overruns, unanticipated cost overruns to get you through there. We want to get you home at night, even if you have a bit of range anxiety. So cloud computing in the cloud has tremendous resources. It used to be things like, oh, how much RAM you had available, how much storage were your primary limiting factors. But that's no longer true. It's very elastic. We can scale up enormously. Apply for strides discounts. They are substantial. They will make your life better. Purge intermediate files, compress the rest. And then on the compute size, benchmark, really try to optimize it. I think in the future, moving forward, there's a call to arms to sort of software developers to really pay close attention to costs. Anything you can do to decrease RAM, decrease computing, decrease storage will be a huge attribute and success for the entire community. There's a lot of great people that want to do this work within the Galaxy community. This work was really, this benchmarking effort was really promoted by NSFGen and others at Johns Hopkins. And then with the AnVIL team, it's been just really wonderful working with all of our collaborators, especially led by Jeff Leake on the data outreach side. So I think I have about a minute left here to take any questions. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mike. This is a great presentation, and also thanks for the highlight for Strides. Just to note, we are now also partnering with Microsoft Azure, so adding a third cloud to our cloud platform capability. How did you choose Google? What's the difference between the different cloud providers, and any advice that you can offer folks?
Yeah, it's a great question, and there's a lot of factors that went into it. What we were doing when we were sort of designing the AnVIL, we knew that this was going to be a very large resource and was going to need to support a huge number of researchers and a lot of sort of data. And we had, we called up all the major vendors. We called up Amazon, we called up Azure, we called up Google Cloud. And it was really Google Cloud that could just sort of provide the best opportunity for our researchers in terms of the support they would give us, sort of the cost model that they'd be able to provide for us. But we knew that was just the beginning. Moving into the future, we're about maybe a year or two away from offering the AnVIL also inside of Azure. Down the road, we may consider other platforms as well. So it's really up to you, the researcher. In the here and now, we started with Google Cloud, but we do acknowledge that these different clouds provide different opportunities.